Viking trade and exploration, beyond the raids. Welcome to this journey through time. Tonight, we'll drift back over 1,000 years, to an era when the North Atlantic belonged to a people who mastered both wind and wave. This is the story of Viking trade and exploration, beyond the raids. Close your eyes, and let yourself imagine the early morning mist rolling across a fjord in 9th century Norway. The year is around 820, and the world is about to change in ways no one could predict. The Viking Age, stretching from roughly 793 to 1066, lasted nearly 3 centuries. But what most don't realize is that this period wasn't primarily defined by warfare. For the vast majority of Norse people, life revolved around farming, craftsmanship, and above all, trade. You see, while history remembers the dramatic raid on Lindisfarne in 793 as the beginning of the Viking Age, the truth is far more nuanced. The Norse had been sailors and traders long before that fateful day. Their homeland, with its countless waterways, deep fjords and sprawling coastline, had shaped them into a seafaring people out of necessity. Scandinavia's geography was both a blessing and a challenge. The numerous waterways and long coastlines meant that boats weren't just useful, they were essential for survival. Communities separated by mountains and forests found it easier to travel by water than by land. This geographic reality forged the Norse into master shipbuilders and navigators. Picture a Viking settlement in early spring. The ice has melted, the seas have calmed, and families begin preparing for the trading season ahead. Most Vikings, you see, were not professional merchants. They were farmers first, and their main income came from agriculture, property, and the collection of taxes and fees. Trading was something they did seasonally, when the weather permitted and the harvest had been gathered. Now, let's talk about the vessels that made it all possible. When we think of Viking ships, our minds often conjure images of the sleek, menacing longship, the dragon-proud warship that struck fear into coastal communities across Europe. But there was another type of vessel, less celebrated but far more important to the Viking economy. This was the knarr, the sturdy merchant ship that was the true workhorse of Viking trade. Unlike the narrow, swift longship built for war and raids, the knarr was designed with a very different purpose in mind. It was wider, deeper, and shorter than its military cousin. Where a longship might carry 60 warriors, a knarr needed only a crew of 5 to 7 sailors. Imagine standing on a dock in early Viking Age Norway, watching a knarr being loaded for a journey. These remarkable vessels could carry up to 24 tons of cargo, and in some cases, even more. The largest knarr ever discovered, found in the trading port of Hedeby around 1025, measured 22 meters in length and could transport an astounding 60 tons of goods. The knarr's design was ingenious in its simplicity. Built using the same clinker method as longships, where overlapping oak planks were riveted together, the knarr's wider hull and higher sides made it far more stable in rough ocean waters. Its rounded hull shape helped it cut through waves rather than fight against them. In the center of the ship was a deep cargo hold, open to the sky, while beneath the decks at bow and stern lay additional storage space. Unlike the longship, which relied heavily on oars and muscle, the knarr was primarily a sailing vessel. A large square sail, measuring up to 110 square meters, provided its main propulsion. The ship carried only 2 to 4 oars, used mainly for maneuvering in harbors and navigating narrow channels. This reliance on wind power meant that a handful of skilled sailors could manage a vessel carrying the wealth of kingdoms. Think about what this meant for Viking commerce. A small crew could transport massive quantities of goods across vast distances, making long-distance trade not just possible, but profitable. These ships carried the treasures of the north, amber from the Baltic shores, warm furs from Scandinavian forests, honey from Norwegian hives, and timber from ancient woodlands. They also transported walrus ivory, a luxury item highly prized in medieval Europe, as well as wool, wheat, and even livestock. But the knarr carried more than just trade goods. When Norse families set out to colonize new lands, Iceland, Greenland, and even the distant shores of North America, it was the sturdy knarr that carried their futures. Entire households could be transported, families with their belongings, horses standing in specially constructed stalls, sheep huddled together against the ocean spray, and all the tools, seeds, and provisions needed to start life anew in an unknown land. Let yourself drift now, imagining the gentle creak of oak planks, the snap of a large wool sail catching the wind, and the endless horizon of the North Atlantic stretching before a knarr's bow. The crew would have had no shelter from the elements. They bundled in thick furs and wool, taking turns at rest, exposed to salt spray and northern cold. Yet they sailed on, driven by the promise of profit, the hope of new land, or simply the call of the unknown. These weren't warriors seeking glory. They were merchants seeking fortune, families seeking opportunity, and craftsmen seeking markets for their wares. This was the quiet side of Viking achievement, less dramatic than the raids perhaps, but far more significant in shaping the medieval world. And so our journey begins, following these traders across the known world, from the frozen shores of Greenland to the sun-baked markets of Constantinople. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you deeper into sleep, as we continue exploring the vast trading networks that connected continents. As dawn breaks over the Baltic Sea, let us now turn our attention to the heart of Viking commerce, the great trading towns that served as meeting points for merchants from across the known world. Before the Viking Age, Scandinavia had no real towns. The landscape was dotted with small farming and fishing villages, nothing more. But at the beginning of the 8th century, something remarkable happened. The first proper trading towns began to emerge, carefully placed at central locations along Scandinavia's coasts, near natural harbors and sheltered fjords. These weren't accidental developments. Some trading centers started as small seasonal markets on beaches, growing organically over time. But others, and this is fascinating, were planned from the very beginning, laid out according to rigid town plans with organized streets and designated plots. Such ambitious projects could only have been initiated by powerful individuals, kings or local magnates who recognized the value of creating safe havens for commerce. Let us visit the most important of these towns, starting with Hedeby, located in what is now northern Germany, though in the Viking Age it was firmly part of Denmark. Hedeby was Denmark's crown jewel of trade, and its success stemmed from one crucial advantage: its location at the junction of land and water routes. The town sat at the inner end of the Schlei Fjord, controlling both the north-south trade routes between Europe and Scandinavia, and the east-west routes connecting the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. Imagine being able to transport goods overland across this narrow neck of land, avoiding the long and dangerous voyage around the northern tip of Denmark. This shortcut made fortunes. Picture Hedeby at its height, around the year 1000. The town was home to approximately 1,000 people, a significant population for the time, all living within protective fortifications. Inside these walls ran a network of streets where merchants and craftsmen conducted their business under the protection and control of the Danish king. The archaeological remains show us a well-organized community, workshops for metalworking, areas for shipbuilding, storage facilities, and bustling marketplaces. The founding of Hedeby itself tells us much about Viking politics and commerce. In the year 808, the Danish king Godfrey destroyed a rival trading town called Rarik, located in what is now northern Germany. After the attack, Godfrey forced all of Rarik's merchants and craftsmen to relocate to Hedeby. This wasn't mere conquest, it was calculated economic warfare. By eliminating competition and concentrating trade in Hedeby, the king could demand taxes from a larger pool of merchants, filling the royal coffers while making Hedeby the undisputed commercial center of the region. But Hedeby was not alone. Let us drift northward now, across the waters to Sweden, to a small island in Lake Mälaren. Here sat Birka, founded in the early 700s, presumably by royal decree. Like Hedeby, Birka was a well-organized trading center, bustling with activity year-round. Merchants traveled here from across Scandinavia to exchange northern goods, furs and rope, timber and iron, for treasures from the east, Arabic silver, luxury fabrics, and exotic provisions. The location of Birka was no accident. Situated on the island of Jorko, about 30 kilometers west of where Stockholm stands today, Birka had access to Lake Mälaren, which spans an impressive 120 kilometers from east to west. The area around the lake was rich, extraordinarily rich, in natural resources. The Swedes who lived here exported iron ore and furs in vast quantities, generating enormous wealth for the region. Through Birka and the Baltic island of Gotland, Swedish merchants connected with the great river routes running through what is now Russia. These routes led all the way to Constantinople and the Islamic Caliphate in Baghdad, where luxury goods beyond imagination could be obtained: silks from China, spices from distant lands, glassware of exquisite beauty. Now let us journey to Norway, to a trading center with a particularly telling name. Around the year 780, some 20 to 30 years before Hedeby was established, Norwegian traders founded Kaupang on the Oslo fjord. The name itself, Kaupanger, literally means marketplace or trading place in Old Norse. At its peak, Kaupang hosted perhaps 1,000 inhabitants, a remarkable number for the time. Archaeological excavations at Kaupang have revealed over 100,000 artifacts, painting a vivid picture of this bustling commercial hub. The town was laid out in an organized grid pattern, with designated areas for commercial and residential activities. Workshops stood alongside merchant houses and storage facilities. The artifacts discovered there speak of Kaupang's role as a cultural melting pot. Objects from across the Viking world and beyond, mixing Nordic craftsmanship with Frankish metalwork and Eastern luxuries. These trading towns operated on a seasonal rhythm in their early years. At first, the trading centers were only used during the warm seasons, late spring, summer, and early fall. As winter approached and the seas grew dangerous, merchants would return to their farms, and the towns would empty, waiting silently for spring's return. But as the towns grew in importance and permanence, more people began to live there year-round: craftsmen who set up permanent workshops, merchants who maintained storage facilities, and the families who supported this growing urban life. The success of these towns depended on one crucial element: security. Merchants traveling with valuable goods needed protection, and the kings provided it, for a price. The revenue generated from trade taxes was enormously valuable to Scandinavian rulers, and they went to great lengths to maintain safe marketplaces and eliminate competition. Let the image settle in your mind now. Imagine walking through Hedeby's streets on a summer morning. The smell of wood smoke from cooking fires, the ring of hammer on anvil from a blacksmith's workshop, the calls of merchants advertising their wares. Ships from Norway arriving with soapstone vessels. Danish traders preparing iron goods for export. The glint of Arabic silver changing hands, measured carefully on bronze scales. These were not savage raiders, but sophisticated urbanites engaged in international commerce, their lives intertwined with trading partners from England to the Islamic world, from the Frankish kingdoms to the Byzantine Empire. And yet, for all their success, these great trading towns would not last forever. By the end of the Viking Age, changes were coming. Shifts in trade routes, rising water levels, and the centralization of royal power would transform or abandon these once thriving centers. But that is a story for another time. For now, rest in this moment of commercial prosperity, when the trading towns of Scandinavia connected distant worlds, and the wealth of nations flowed through Nordic hands. Now let us turn our attention to something remarkable, something that connects the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-baked markets of Baghdad and Samarkand. Let us explore the story of silver, and the mysterious coins that traveled thousands of kilometers to reach Viking hands. Between the years 800 and 950, something extraordinary happened. Islamic silver coins, known as dirhams, flooded into Scandinavia in astounding quantities. Modern researchers estimate that perhaps as many as 1 billion dirhams made their way north during this period. To put this in perspective, Scandinavian museums today possess nearly 500,000 of these coins, more than any other region in the world outside the Islamic heartlands themselves. Imagine holding one of these coins in your hand. Each dirham was made of remarkably pure silver, often 90 to 95%, and bore Arabic inscriptions, verses from the Quran, the name of the reigning caliph, and the place and date of minting. These coins came from cities whose names sing like poetry: Samarkand, Tashkent, Baghdad, places that must have seemed impossibly distant and exotic to Norse traders. But why silver? Why did the Vikings prize these particular coins above all others? The Vikings operated what historians call a bullion economy. Unlike the Islamic world, where different denominations of coins, gold dinars, silver dirhams, copper fowls, circulated based on their face value, the Norse cared only about one thing: the weight of the silver itself. To them, a coin was not currency in our modern sense, it was simply a convenient portable form of precious metal. This led to a practice that would horrify any coin collector today. Vikings routinely cut their silver coins into pieces. This wasn't vandalism, it was practical economics. They called these fragments hack silver. When a transaction required payment of a certain weight of silver, they would simply cut a coin or piece of jewelry to the appropriate size. Archaeological finds show us coins cut into halves, quarters, even tiny slivers. Picture a merchant at Birka, preparing for a transaction. He brings out his balance scales, delicate bronze instruments that have been found in trading sites across Scandinavia. On one side of the scale, he places the goods to be purchased. On the other, he carefully adds pieces of hack silver until the scales balance perfectly. The Arabic inscriptions on the coin fragments meant nothing to him, what mattered was that the silver weighed true. Some coins bear witness to even more careful scrutiny. Archaeologists have found dirhams with tiny notches cut into their edges, evidence that traders were shaving off minute quantities of silver to test the purity of the metal. This wasn't distrust, but professional caution. In an economy based on weight and purity, knowing exactly what you held was essential. But not all silver remained in coin form. Archaeological excavations have uncovered something fascinating: lumps of half-melted silver with dirham coins still visible, frozen in the act of being transformed. The Vikings melted down many of these foreign coins, recasting them into jewelry, arm rings, neck rings, and small ingots more suitable for local trade. The silver that had once circulated in the bazaars of the Abbasid Caliphate was reborn as Norse treasure, intricate metalwork that displayed both the craftsman's skill and the owner's wealth. The routes by which these coins traveled north tell their own story of Viking enterprise and daring. Swedish Vikings, known in the east as the Russ, journeyed along the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They followed the Volga River south to the Caspian Sea, and the Dnieper River to the Black Sea and beyond. At the thriving markets along these waterways, they encountered Muslim merchants eager to trade. What did the Vikings offer in exchange for this river of silver? They brought the treasures of the northern forests and seas, thick furs from Arctic foxes and martens, highly prized in warmer climates, walrus ivory and reindeer antlers, timber from ancient forests, amber from Baltic shores, and though it darkens our story, they also traded in human beings. The slave trade, tragic as it was, formed a significant part of Viking commerce, with captives taken during raids finding their way to markets in Constantinople and Baghdad. The Swedish island of Gotland became a nexus of this eastern trade. Gotland alone has yielded more than 70,000 Arab dirhams, making it one of the richest archaeological sites for Viking-age Islamic silver in all of Europe. The island's position in the Baltic made it a natural meeting point, a place where eastern and western trade routes intersected, where merchants from across the Viking world gathered to exchange goods and silver. Let your mind drift now to these trading encounters. A Swedish merchant recently returned from the Volga, his ship laden with bags of silver dirhams. A Norwegian trader from Kaupang, carrying barrels of seal oil and bundled furs. A Danish craftsman from Hedeby, displaying intricately worked bronze brooches. All meeting on Gotland's shores, their scales and weights at the ready, speaking different dialects but sharing the universal language of commerce. The flow of these silver coins wasn't merely economic, it was cultural. Despite the vast religious and linguistic differences between the Norse pagans and Muslim merchants, they engaged in peaceful, regular trade. The presence of these coins in graves, in hoards, in workshop floors across Scandinavia speaks to how thoroughly integrated they became in Viking life. Some Vikings valued the coins so highly that they created imitations. Archaeologists have found counterfeit dirhams bearing pseudo-Arabic script, sometimes gibberish, sometimes actual Arabic words copied without understanding. These forgeries weren't meant to deceive trading partners in the Islamic world, but rather served the local Scandinavian market, where the aesthetic and cultural cachet of the dirham had become desirable in its own right. Rest now in this image, silver flowing like water from the warm lands of the south to the cold north, connecting two civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers, different gods, different languages, yet united in the ancient dance of trade. The glint of Arab silver in a Norse chieftain's treasure hoard. The weight of prosperity, measured grain by grain on bronze scales. The dirham coins tell us that the Vikings were not isolated northerners, but participants in a truly global medieval economy, merchants and traders whose network stretched from the Atlantic to the Caspian, from the frozen Arctic to the deserts of Central Asia. Now that we understand the flow of silver from east to west, let us explore what the Vikings offered in return, and what treasures they brought back to their northern homelands. The Viking trading economy was built on a foundation of northern resources, products that could only be found in the cold lands of Scandinavia and the Arctic regions beyond. Perhaps the most important Viking export was fur. The bitter cold of Scandinavia produced animals with extraordinarily thick pelts, pine martens with their lustrous brown coats, Arctic foxes draped in white winter fur, otters whose pelts were soft as silk, beavers prized for their waterproof qualities, and bears whose massive hides spoke of strength and wilderness. These furs were desperately sought after in the warmer climates of Europe and the Islamic world, where they served as both practical garments and symbols of wealth and status. Imagine a merchant preparing his cargo at Kaupang. Alongside the bundles of fur, he carefully packs walrus tusks, creamy white ivory harvested from the cold waters of the Arctic. This ivory, obtained from Norse settlements in Greenland and the far northern waters, rivaled elephant ivory in medieval markets. It could be carved into intricate chess pieces, religious relics, decorative boxes, objects that would grace the halls of bishops and kings. The Baltic coastline offered another treasure unique to the north, amber. This fossilized tree resin, golden and translucent, washed up on beaches after storms. Vikings collected it, and craftspeople worked it into beads and ornamental objects of remarkable beauty. Amber was believed to have medicinal properties, making it doubly valuable, both beautiful and, in the eyes of medieval buyers, healthful. The Vikings also exported the fruits of their labor and their land. Honey was a precious commodity in an age before refined sugar, and Norse beekeepers produced it in quantity. Beeswax, too, was essential, for candles that lit churches and great halls, for sealing important documents, for countless uses in medieval life. These sweet products of northern summers made their way to markets across Europe. Sweden's iron ore deposits were among the most valuable resources in Scandinavia. Swedish iron was renowned for its quality, and it was primarily sold to Danish traders who shipped it to Hedeby and beyond. From there, it flowed into the wider European economy, where it would be forged into tools, weapons, and all the metal implements that medieval society required. But the Vikings were not merely exporters of raw materials, they were skilled craftspeople whose products were sought across the known world. Norse artisans created sought-after goods, combs carved from deer antlers with remarkable precision, jewelry worked in intricate patterns, tools and weapons of superior quality. Woolen textiles produced in Scandinavia were particularly prized. Thick, warm, and durable, they were exported throughout Europe. Now, let us turn to what the Vikings brought home from their travels. Close your eyes and picture the cargo hold of a knarr returning from Constantinople, laden with the luxuries of the south. Silk, the most precious fabric in the medieval world, came from Byzantium and ultimately, from China along the legendary Silk Road. The finest silk garments indicated status and wealth in Viking society. Archaeological excavations have found silk in many Scandinavian graves, its remarkable durability allowing it to survive in the ground for over 1,000 years. A Norse chieftain might be buried wearing silk from China, silver from Baghdad, and jewelry made in his own land, a testament to the global reach of Viking trade. Wine flowed north from the vineyards of Germany and France, a drink of the wealthy and a marker of high status. No grapes grew in the cold Scandinavian climate, so every drop had to be imported. Spices, too, were treasured imports. While Scandinavians grew caraway, thyme, and mustard in their own gardens, exotic spices like cinnamon, pepper, and other seasonings from distant lands could only be obtained through trade. These aromatic treasures could transform a simple meal into a feast worthy of a king's hall. From Western Europe came glass products, beads for adornment, vessels for drinking, objects of remarkable beauty created by craftsmen in the Frankish kingdoms. Glass bead production centers even emerged in Scandinavia itself, at places like Aarhus in southern Sweden and Ribe in Denmark, where artisans learned the techniques and created their own works. Ceramics and fine pottery also made the journey north, bringing new styles and technologies to Norse craftspeople. Let yourself drift now into the marketplace at Hedeby on a warm summer day. The air is alive with languages, Old Norse in its various dialects, Slavic tongues, Arabic, perhaps even Greek. A merchant from Norway displays his soapstone vessels, heavy and practical, weighing 5 to 6 kilograms each, so heavy to transport that their common presence in Denmark speaks to the robust nature of Viking trade networks. Among the more practical imports were salt, essential for preserving food through the long northern winters, and grain. Not all parts of Scandinavia were equally fertile, and grain imports helped supplement local production, ensuring communities could feed themselves through the darker months of the year. Nearby, a trader who has just returned from the east unpacks his treasures with careful hands. There are fruits that don't grow in the north, dried dates perhaps, or figs. There are gems and jewelry from Byzantine workshops, their craftsmanship surpassing anything yet produced in Scandinavia. There are weapons too, fine Frankish swords whose steel is of such quality that Norse smiths sometimes remove the blades from their hilts and remount them in Norse-style grips, blending foreign excellence with local tradition. The variety of goods moving through these trading towns was staggering. Everything from everyday necessities to the rarest luxuries could be found. A farmer might come to trade surplus grain for a new iron axe. A chieftain's wife might purchase silk fabric for a new dress. A craftsman might buy raw silver to melt down and rework into jewelry in the latest style. This wasn't just economic exchange, it was cultural transmission. Ideas traveled with the goods. Artistic styles crossed borders. Technologies spread. A glass bead maker in Ribe learned techniques from Frankish craftsmen. A Norse jeweler saw Islamic designs on coins and incorporated similar patterns into his own work. Trade was the thread that wove distant civilizations together, creating a medieval world far more connected than we often imagine. Rest now in this moment of commercial abundance. Picture the stalls piled high with furs soft as clouds, the glint of amber in the sunlight, the rich purple of Byzantine silk, the warm glow of glass beads, the sharp scent of exotic spices, the heavy solidity of silver ingots waiting to be weighed and exchanged. The Vikings were not isolated in their cold northern lands. They were participants in a global marketplace, their ships carrying the wealth of nations across the seas, their traders building relationships that spanned continents and cultures. Gentle transition to next segment. Continuing in the same gentle, soothing voice. Now, let us embark on the longest and most arduous of Viking journeys. Close your eyes and imagine you are a Swedish merchant in the year 900, preparing to travel the great eastern routes that will carry you thousands of kilometers from your homeland to the glittering cities of the Byzantine Empire and beyond. The Vikings called it simply the route, what we now know as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. This was an intricate waterway that connected Scandinavia to Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. The journey began in Swedish trading centers like Birka or on the island of Gotland, crossed the Baltic Sea, and then followed a complex network of rivers, lakes, and portages deep into the heart of what is now Russia and Ukraine. Picture the route in your mind. From the Baltic, merchants entered the Gulf of Finland and followed the Neva River into Lake Ladoga, a vast inland sea. From there they traveled up the Fokhof River, passing the trading settlement of Staraya Ladoga, one of the oldest Viking establishments in the east, founded in the early 9th century. They continued past Novgorod, which would grow to become a major trade center where the Volga route and the Dnieper route intersected. But rivers rarely flow conveniently in the exact direction you wish to travel. At several points along the journey, the waterways became impassable, or the route required switching from one river system to another. Here, the Vikings employed a technique called portaging. They would haul their ships out of the water and carry them overland, sometimes for considerable distances, until they reached the next navigable waterway. Imagine the labor involved: a knarr or smaller vessel, its cargo unloaded, lifted by the crew and physically transported across land to waiting water beyond. From the northern rivers, the route eventually connected to the mighty Dnieper River. The Dnieper flowed south toward the Black Sea, but it was not an easy passage. The river contained several major rapids, stretches where the water rushed violently over rocks, making navigation impossible. At these dangerous points, merchants had no choice but to haul their vessels and goods overland once more, past the churning water, vulnerable to attacks from local tribes who knew exactly where the Vikings would be forced to stop. A Byzantine emperor, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, described these journeys in the 10th century. He noted that every June, large flotillas of merchant ships would gather in Kiev, itself a major Viking-founded trading center, and sail together down the Dnieper toward the Black Sea. There was safety in numbers on this perilous journey. The route demanded not only strength but exceptional seamanship. Modern researchers who attempted to recreate this journey in a clinker-built Viking-style vessel found it extraordinarily challenging. Even with experienced sailors, the journey from Sweden to Novgorod took 42 days. From Novgorod to the mouth of the Dnieper required another 89 days, 3 full months of travel. And that was only one direction. But what awaited at journey's end made the hardship worthwhile. The Vikings called Constantinople Miklagard, the great city. And great it truly was. When Norse merchants first glimpsed its elaborate defensive walls, its soaring churches with their golden domes, its stone buildings and paved streets, they must have felt they had entered another world entirely. Compared to Constantinople, even Hedeby seemed primitive and small. There was an alternative eastern route, equally important. The Volga River provided access to different markets. This route led southeast to the Caspian Sea, passing through the lands of the Khazar Khaganate and eventually reaching the markets of the Islamic Caliphate. At the city of Bulgar on the Volga, Viking merchants encountered the westernmost outpost of the Silk Road merchants who had traveled all the way from China with their precious cargoes. Along both these eastern routes, the Vikings established settlements and trading posts. Towns like Novgorod, Kiev, and Gnezdovo became thriving commercial centers, ruled by Scandinavian lords who intermarried with Slavic peoples and gradually created a new hybrid culture. These Scandinavians in the east became known as the Rus, a term that would eventually give its name to Russia itself. By the late 10th century, these Rus had been living along the Dnieper and Volga for generations, no longer truly Scandinavian but not entirely Slavic either, a new people born from trade and settlement. The relationship between the Rus and Constantinople was complex. While they traded peacefully most of the time, Vikings also occasionally attacked Byzantine territories, laying siege to Constantinople in 860 and again in 907. Yet despite these conflicts, Viking warriors became highly sought after as elite mercenaries. The Byzantine emperors recruited them into the Varangian Guard, an elite unit that served as the emperor's personal bodyguard. This was considered a great honor, and successful Varangian warriors could return home wealthy men, their ships laden with Byzantine gold. Let yourself drift now with these river traders. Imagine the rhythmic splash of oars as the ship moves upstream against the current. The voices of your crew speaking Old Norse, calling out depths and directions. The foreign landscape sliding past, endless forests of birch and pine, villages of peoples whose languages you don't understand, the occasional glimpse of other traders' vessels. At night, the crew pulls the ship to shore and makes camp. A fire is built. Someone produces dried fish and flatbread. Another unpacks a small bag of precious salt. The conversation turns to what you'll trade in Constantinople. The furs you carry will fetch good silver there, and perhaps you can buy silk to bring home, or spices, or fine weapons. The eastern routes were more than trade highways, they were cultural bridges. Orthodox Christians, pagan Slavs, Jewish Khazars, and Muslim merchants from the Abbasid Caliphate all interacted along these waterways. Ideas flowed as freely as goods. Technologies spread. Religious concepts crossed borders. Even games traveled these routes. Chess was introduced to medieval Rus via the Caspian-Volga trade routes from Persia and Arabia. Rest now in this image of connection. Scandinavia linked to Byzantium, linked to the Islamic world, linked to the distant Silk Road of China. All connected by rivers and the determination of traders willing to portage their ships across land, brave rapids and hostile tribes, and journey for months to reach distant markets. The Vikings were not isolated northerners. They were participants in a vast Eurasian trading system, their presence felt from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the Caspian to Constantinople. We have traveled east with Viking merchants to the great cities of Constantinople and Baghdad. Now let us turn westward, out into the vast, unknown Atlantic Ocean, where Norse explorers pushed beyond all familiar horizons. In the late 9th century, Norwegian Vikings discovered Iceland, not through careful planning, but through the fortune of the sea. A sailor named Narrated, blown off course while sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands in 861, found himself approaching a snow-covered island. He called it Snowland and returned to Norway to tell of his discovery. Within decades, Norse settlers were establishing farms on this volcanic island, creating a new society in what had been an essentially uninhabited landscape, save perhaps for a few Irish monks who soon departed. Iceland became more than a settlement, it became a stepping stone. In the 980s, a red-haired Norwegian exile named Erik Thorvaldsson, Erik the Red, found himself banished from Iceland for killing a man. Rather than spend his 3-year exile in Norway, Erik sailed west to investigate rumors of land beyond Iceland's horizon. He explored the southwestern coast of an enormous island, and when he returned to Iceland, he spoke enthusiastically of the green land he had found, perhaps the first recorded use of marketing in service of colonization. The name Greenland was deliberately chosen to attract settlers. Despite the misleading name, most of the island was covered in ice. Norse families did establish 2 main settlements, the eastern settlement at the southwestern tip, and the western settlement about 500 kilometers up the west coast, near where the modern city of Nuuk now stands. The settlers raised livestock, hunted walrus for their valuable ivory, and exported furs and wool back to Iceland and beyond. Life in Greenland was challenging, but the Norse adapted remarkably. They transplanted European agricultural practices into an environment of short growing seasons and severe winters, creating self-reliant communities that persisted for centuries. But Greenland was not the end of their westward journey. Around the year 985, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing from Iceland to Greenland when storms blew his ship off course. After 3 days of sailing through fog and uncertainty, Bjarni sighted land to the west, land covered with forests, unlike the barren shores of Greenland. Bjarni, eager only to find his father's farm in Greenland, did not go ashore. But he described what he had seen when he finally reached his destination. 15 years later, someone did investigate. Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, purchased Bjarni's ship and set out to find the lands described. Around the year 1000, Leif and his crew of 35 men sailed west from Greenland. They first encountered a land of flat stones and glaciers, which Leif named Helgeland, the land of flat stones. Sailing south, they found a forested land they called Markland, the land of forests. Finally, they reached a place where salmon swam in the rivers and wild grapes grew on the vines. Leif named this land Vinland, the land of wine. Here, the Norse built temporary structures and stayed through one winter, gathering timber and grapes to bring back to Greenland. For centuries, these stories were considered mere legends, fantastical tales recorded in Icelandic sagas. But in 1960, archaeologists Helga and Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lance aux Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland. The site could house between 70 and 90 people and dates to approximately the year 1000, exactly when the sagas say Leif Erikson was exploring Vinland. The Vikings had reached North America, 500 years before Columbus. Leif's brother Thorvald led a second expedition and spent 2 years in Vinland before dying in a skirmish with indigenous peoples. A wealthy Icelandic trader named Thorfinn Karlsefni led a third major expedition, bringing livestock and attempting to establish a permanent settlement. They stayed for 3 years, and Thorfinn's wife Gudrid even gave birth to a son in Vinland, the first European child born in the Americas. But ultimately, the settlement failed. The Norse called the indigenous peoples they encountered Skraelings. Initial attempts at trade sometimes succeeded, but cultural misunderstandings and competition for resources led to violence. The sagas record battles where Vikings faced warriors in hide boats, armed with bows and arrows. Unlike in Iceland or even Greenland, where the Norse encountered either no one or sparse populations, in Vinland they faced organized resistance. The hostility proved too great, and the Norse abandoned their American settlements. Yet contact continued in more limited ways. Historical records suggest that Greenlanders continued to sail to Markland, likely present-day Labrador, to harvest timber, which was precious in tree-poor Greenland. In 1347, Icelandic annals record a ship from Greenland arriving in Iceland after having been blown off course while sailing to Markland for wood. The Norse knowledge of lands across the Western Ocean persisted for generations. But by the 14th century, even the Greenland settlements faced decline. The onset of the Little Ice Age made farming increasingly difficult. Sea ice expanded, making navigation treacherous and cutting Greenland off from regular contact with Iceland and Norway. Trade became difficult, then impossible. By 1408, the Norse settlements in Greenland had been abandoned, their inhabitants either having perished, returned to Iceland, or, in theories still debated, perhaps assimilated with the indigenous Inuit peoples who were expanding southward. The western adventure of the Vikings had come to an end. Let yourself rest now in the quiet aftermath of these journeys. Picture the descendants of Vikings scattered across the North Atlantic, in Iceland, where their culture would endure and flourish, preserving the sagas that told of their ancestors' exploits. In Norway and Denmark and Sweden, where the Viking Age was giving way to the medieval kingdoms of Scandinavia. In the British Isles, where Norse settlers had left permanent marks on the landscape, the language, and the people. The Vikings, these farmers and traders, these explorers and merchants, had connected disparate worlds. They had carried Islamic silver from Baghdad to Sweden, silk from China to Norway, walrus ivory from Greenland to Constantinople. They had sailed rivers deep into Russia and established trading towns that would grow into great cities. They had crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, discovering Iceland, Greenland, and North America. All of this accomplished not primarily through warfare, but through trade. Through the patient accumulation of knowledge about winds and currents, harbors and river routes, markets and trading partners. Through the willingness to travel for months, to learn foreign languages, to negotiate with strangers whose culture seemed impossibly different from their own. The knarrs that carried these merchants have long since rotted away. The silver dirhams have been scattered to museums or melted down. The trading towns of Hedeby and Birka have fallen silent, their streets covered by earth and centuries. But the impact of Viking trade endures, in the cities they founded, in the routes they pioneered, in the connections they forged between distant civilizations. Sleep now and dream of vast horizons, of ships under sail on endless waters, of merchants meeting in markets where a dozen languages mingle, of silver changing hands by weight, of furs and silks and amber and spices, of the great trading network that connected the medieval world, carried on the ships and in the hearts of Viking traders. Rest peacefully, knowing that trade has always been humanity's way of reaching across divides, of finding common ground, of building connections that last longer than any raid or conquest. The Vikings were traders. The Vikings were explorers. The Vikings built bridges across the medieval world. And now, their story carries you gently into sleep.